Oh my god! Oh my gosh! Oh no! Oh no!
Danny Wrench and Danya Naroditsky going a bit nuts at the final move of this classic Carlsen Gukesh game. Now I had to mute a tiny part of that clip or else it would have given away the move. So this is the Speed Chess Championship. It was played a couple months ago. Both players have 3 minutes and 1 second on the clock, and we've got some wild blitz action coming your way here. So Gukesh kicks off with pawn to d4. Now we get a standard looking opening here. We get the Queen's Gambit declined after these few moves. But now Magnus, he plays the 10th most popular move here of pawn to h6. So he's not developing pieces, he's not doing anything with his c pawn in the centre, so it's a bit of a sideline. Now we get g3 from Gukesh, but he's got such an interesting idea in mind, because after Carlsen develops the bishop, he now goes pawn to a3, so a tiny pawn move of his own on another side of the board. What's the idea of this? Well, he's goading Carlsen into castles, which Magnus does, and now check this out for an aggressive move. Gukesh is chasing the match. He goes pawn g4. So there's a really attacking idea behind this, because if black takes the pawn, then you can immediately slide over the rook, and if that knight retreats, then you crash through here, already using the pin, already using the fact the king castled, you pushed h6. So coming back here, Carlsen hops his knight into the centre of the board, and it's a good move because it opens up the queen to the defence and it gets away from the pawn storm which is coming over there. So queen c2 played, pressures that knight, and now Carlsen plays a very committal move of pawn to f5. And it allows Gukesh to rip open the g file, and although he's bolstered this knight, well, you're actually leaving the defence of the d pawn now, and here we see it snapped off. You also could have captured with the knight, and Carlsen probably realised he was in trouble here, and he decides to just develop a piece, try and bring some firepower into the game. He goes knight d7. Now you can win a pawn here by taking on e4, recapturing with the queen, but then the idea is to go knight f6 and win this one back. Now it's still actually good for white, you can get a decent attack raging on in this kind of line, but instead Gukesh, he wants to keep queens on the board, keep the pressure, so he goes rook to g1 to start with, and it creates a really uncomfortable question for Magnus, because you'd love to sidestep your king, come away from the pin, take away this threat. But then you can capture on e4, queen recaptures, and this time after knight f6, you can jump the queen into g6, and there's lots of problems here. The bishop is still coming. This is a huge attack for white. So instead, we see Magnus bring the knight. He lets Gukesh take this pawn, but Gukesh doesn't do it. Why does he not do it? Well, he seems to have been spooked by this knight g4 move. Hits the bishop, also hits the f2 pawn, it gets complicated. But white can actually take on g7, king captures, pawn h3, uses the pin, white's better. But okay, Gukesh didn't like the look of it, so instead he captures here. Magnus goes with the pawn, and now the knight hops into e5 and white remains better. King h7 played, comes off the g file. Here we see Gukesh developing, and after bishop to f5, he just castles the king, and he's not afraid of this pawn pushing, open up the attack, because actually the queen can take with check, the bishop's not defended. So instead, we see bishop takes on e5. Not technically best, you could have actually started with the knight taking here, because after pawn recaptures, knight takes, well, now there's some problems down this open d file with the rook lined up against the queen. When the bishop was on d6, those problems weren't such an issue, but Gukesh doesn't find the best way to play here. His best was queen to b3, steps away from the bishop's attack, also pressures the knight and this pawn, but he goes e3, gets a bit spooked by this bishop staring down here. Now queen e7 breaks the d file pin, and bishop c4 finally develops and pressures that knight. So Magnus defends, pawn f3, trying to take advantage of this bishop that's now undefended since the rook went away, and so we don't see a captures here, but the knight retreats back and hits this bishop. Gukesh drops, and now pawn c5 from Magnus, and look at the clock times. He's got 8 seconds left already to Gukesh's 54, and this is move 20, it goes to move 59, and now Gukesh goes wrong already. he should capture this pawn here, hit the bishop, and after Magnus drops back, well then you can either capture or even go bishop to d5, because if takes, you'll be recapturing with a discovered check from the queen. But what we see in the game here is pawn e6, but now c4 comes, and after the bishop retreats, well Magnus is just winning a pawn and the bishop is locked out. Advantage Magnus now. So bishop c3 pressures this pawn in combination with the rook. We now see an exchange with check. The queen recaptures, the rook defends, and after queen d4, more pressure on the g-pawn, it kicks on here to g5. And Gukesh now goes wrong, but he's also low on time. His best was pawn to f4, but he goes bishop b1 trying to reactivate that piece. However, it allows Magnus to win another pawn here, and after e4, bishop drops back, he goes pawn h4, just trying to rip open lines. Both players now under 10 seconds, and Magnus had a very strong move here of pawn g4, solidifying a pawn chain supported by the queen. But in true Magnus style, he drops back that queen, saying, okay, let's trade queens, I love endgames, it's a slightly better endgame for me. We see a captures on g5, the queens come off the board, pawn takes back, and now this is really interesting from Magnus. He just pushes his h-pawn, keeps this rook locked out of the game. Really nice idea. King d2. Now the rook activates, pressures the pawn, the king defends, and after rook f8 back, we can see the threat to push f2, so Gukesh preempts and slides his rook over. And now Magnus needs to activate this knight into the game. It's locked out, it can't jump here, so he goes knight to d7, and there's two pawns on prise here as being highlighted on the board. Gukesh doesn't take this one. It is possible, but after pawn b6, well the bishop's now looking a bit trapped. Now there's some tactics going on. The rook can attack the knight, which is defending the pawn, and it gets a bit complicated. But you don't want to go in for that as white when you can win a clean pawn here, plus chop off that dangerous passed pawn that black had going. So rook takes, the king takes back, pawn a6 now defends that one, and king f4 starts to activate. And now Gukesh is the one who's slightly better in this endgame. He's got the two bishops and he's got two passed pawns versus Magnus's one. King g8, Magnus brings the king around. Bishop c2, we see this one worm out of the box now. b5, bishop d1, king f7 and bishop f3. It finally fully activates into the game, although the pawn does need to push to have the eyes opened. King e7 played, and now bishop g2 looks to come onto this diagonal here, and now knight f8 looks to redeploy, check the king and win the bishop. So we get a check from c5, the king goes, and now we see Gukesh just go slightly wrong. He should drop this bishop back, keep his bishop pair, but after king e5, he allows Magnus to check, chop off one of those dangerous bishops, and suddenly the position is level again. Gukesh had an edge. Here comes the king, marching in front of the pawn, so Gukesh steps back, stops the advance. Now pawn h4, passed pawns have to be pushed as they say. Bishop h3 check, king e7, and after king e3, a5, we see Magnus's idea to create a passed pawn on the queen side using his 3-on-2. So the king comes across, pressures this pawn, stops b4, the bishop drops back defending, renews the threat, so Gukesh goes king c5, but now there's another problem of bishop to e6, and if you exchange off the bishops after king recaptures, you're dead lost, because the h-pawn is running way too fast and these pawns can always be stopped by the black king. It's inside the box. So here we see the bishop retreat, give ground. Magnus goes back to d7, covers this pawn, and after e5 from Gukesh, this is now an awesome move from Magnus, so typical of his style. So in this position, Magnus played pawn to b4. Now what's the idea? It looks like the king can just recapture if you take back. But no, that's not what Magnus wants to do. He goes pawn c3. Now you have to capture, you don't want that one running through, and then a4. He's given two pawns just to release a pawn, and it reminds me so much of another game of his that I covered. I'll link at the end. Now this one's rolling, however, Gukesh can go g6, a3 and then bishop c4. It covers the advance of the pawn. Now best for Magnus here was to actually come onto this diagonal and challenge it. And there's a long line here which actually ends in what should be a drawing position. But the point is Magnus queens first, he can start checking. So even though he's a pawn down, should technically be a draw. But still, white's the one with any chances. But after bishop c4, Magnus pushes his pawn. However, this is a bit different because Gukesh is just faster here, makes the queen first. Magnus queens, but now check. The king goes, and from this position here, it's mate in 13, but there are even quicker mates if black goes wrong. However, Gukesh, he goes wrong. He should check Magnus. I mean, just check from any square. Start checking, then use your bishop, use your king, use your pawn if you have to. You know, this is one typical line, just to play it through, show you what could happen here and how you get mated. But he doesn't go in for any of this. Instead, in this position, Gukesh goes king to d6 and look at the eval bar go. Can you spot the checkmate in one move? This is what Magnus does. He shuts the trap. That's mate. The pawn stops this retreating square. It's just brutal. And here the guys just freak out. The commentators can't believe it. Gukesh can't believe it. Magnus can't believe it. He goes 16-2 up in the match and wins the match overall.